Welcome to the 16th India Policy Forum. Rakesh Mohan, my predecessor. The real predecessor who started the India Policy Forum is not here because he's celebrating his 70th birthday, Suman Berry, but we do owe him a great debt for having started the India Policy Forum. Those of you who have been old hands know that we started 16 years ago with Brookings in DC at that time. We ran the partnership for a very large number of years, and then along the way decided that we'd had a good run and we now should separate. So welcome also to our new auditorium. We had a taste of it yesterday in a different setting with the first T.N. Srinivasan Memorial Lecture. The India Policy Forum has stood out, I think, for a couple of things. One, that it's really like an editorial board meeting where you're all the editors, in a sense, and we are deeply getting into deeply into every paper that we commission. And we try to pick the topics so that they hit the right spots at the right time. And I think this year we've been exceptionally lucky in the choice of topics, as many have commented already. In the past, we did this to encourage empirical work on India, which was not getting enough of a forum, and that's why the name Forum. And we certainly, I think, have succeeded in that endeavor. Along the way, and thanks to the new induction of editors, Karthik Muralidharan being the latest, but also Barry Bosworth, who unfortunately could not make it today from Washington. He's at Brookings, as you know. We decided that we needed to do state-of-the-art review papers as well. And I think the most prominent one was indeed, and the first one was Karthik's on primary education. And I think it's become a classic in its own right. And we expect that this will follow. We have a paper this year as well that tries to do that. So we've shifted goals along the way as work on India has gained prominence and gained recognition in the global research setting. I don't want to take up too much time. I want to request Karthik to say a few words. As I said, Barry's not here, but he certainly sends his greetings and best wishes. It's hard work pulling this off, and also hard work to do the journal after the conference. Before I end, I want to thank all of you for coming. I hope we'll have 2 productive days. I also want to thank the NCAER staff that has really gone out of its way. This is still a new facility. We have lots of niggling problems, some of which we saw yesterday. But these are all getting sorted out. And this will be the permanent home of the India Policy Forum. So with that, let me hand over to my co-editor, Karthik.
Thanks, Shekhar and team. It's always astounding to see the amount of work that goes into organizing one of these things. But now, being, I guess, the young veteran of these things, it is quite a special part of the annual calendar, in addition to the December one. But I think, like Shekhar was saying, I think my 2 important goals as IPF editor are basically, I think I have 2 main goals, right? One is, as kind of you start seeing journals being more and more welcome to papers from India, I don't think we need to recreate the peer-reviewed journal space in the IPF, but the IPF is a very special vehicle for synthesizing a body of high-quality work to the extent that it is relevant for a policymaker. So, in some sense, the CEA and Niti Aayog and folks like that really are the audience for the work we do, which is, for them to give us some guidance and sense of, here are the core policy questions we are struggling with, and we know there's a lot of work buried in some journal that we don't quite have the bandwidth to go get hold of, So can you, the IPF, commission a set of papers that will allow us to do that. So I think, that's been one goal for me in the IPF. And the second related one is the generational renewal point, which is to kind of create a forum for younger and younger scholars who are doing good work, but are not necessarily connected into what's going on with policy, and provide a platform for that work to be summarized and presented in a way that senior policymakers then have access to what's coming out of that. So, we have a paper by Amit this year. I'm excited that Sam Asher is here, and I plan to commission and something for him for next year. And I think Pranab Bardhan yesterday was talking about the lack of panel data, the lack of analysis of mobility in particular. And Sam, over the past 5 odd years, has done some astounding work in putting together micro data sets that we think will allow us to address exactly some of those issues. And so, yeah, so I think for me, those are the 2 main goals of IPF, policy relevant syntheses based on very high quality academic work, and creating a platform for younger people and encourage people to do more policy relevant work. I think, a last personal note is, I think probably as a young assistant professor, I spend more time doing policy stuff than what is academically considered optimal. But I think the best advice I got from my advisors was do what you think is important and the profession will catch up. And I think the good news in terms of even how the journals, are the very, very top journals, the AER and the QJE, you kind of start seeing an increasing appreciation of just the sheer policy relevance and importance of some of the questions that we tackle in this room relative to did you manage to do some other theoretical tweak somewhere here or there. So I think the profession overall is moving towards more empirical work. The profession is moving towards recognizing policy relevant work. And so hopefully that perceived dichotomy between what is kind of academic rigor and policy relevant, shrinks over time. And the IPF, by providing a forum for high quality policy work to then be presented to policymakers and hopefully kind of get acted on, can help catalyze some of that. So with that, let me kind of turn over to, again, speaking of generational renewal, like the youngest CEA in a long time, to kind of just say a few words and also say something about the kind of questions and the kind of work that you would most value.
Yeah.
So while he's just moving to the podium, I think everybody knows Krishnamurthy Subramanian, our new chief economic advisor, with his first magnum opus, the economic survey that has just been released. And Subbu has been very kind. Subbu, of course, is well known to us from the Neemrana conference, where he has been a frequent and very prominent contributor, and it's great to have him here. Welcome, Subbu.
Yeah. Very good morning, everyone, and thanks to Shekhar and Karthik. I see so many stalwarts here that I'm really, honestly humbled to be here among you. So what I want to do is because the survey just got presented on Thursday, so I'm sure many of you would have seen parts of it, but let me quickly recap and then also talk about some of the ideas I think where there can be, we can benefit substantially from a forum like this. I think it's very, very important. So as not being displayed. Can we have the presentation, please? So while I wait for that presentation to get loaded up, I think the media covered it, substantially, that the blue sky color of the survey was intended to try and lay out some blue sky thinking when I took over office. What I knew very well was that this survey would be the first for a new government. What I did not know would be whether, would it be for a continuation or for a new, a different government. But one thing was for sure, that this gives an opportunity to sort of lay out an agenda for the next 5 years. And that's why we sort of set out trying to think through some of these issues. Okay, so what we've tried to do, the first chapter is titled Shifting Gears, because that was the intent. So just to quickly, I think there is people who have sort of commented on it, have said, oh yes, investment as the driver of growth. We've heard that before, and I'm not going to deny that is certainly private sector driven investment as sort of the driver for economic growth. But the key, there we go. So the key departure, and in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is to actually focus on, at least in our thinking, what we believe is that there are 2 key departures that we're making, especially, first of all, while people have talked about private investment as the driver of economic growth, the evidence that we've presented in the first chapter of volume 1 of the survey is essentially to show that rather than thinking about different problems, whether it's about jobs, demand, exports, etc., as silos, what we've tried to do here is to think about them as a system. And I think, partly this is because of my initial training in engineering, which is what sort of led me to think about it, marry it to what I've learned in economics. Better understand this as a system. And second, I think now we recognize very well the work after the financial crisis has highlighted that systems are rarely in equilibrium. They're either in a virtuous or a vicious cycle, and these are sort of two key departures that we think we've made in the way we think about the economy, and that's why the focus on investment as the key driver of this virtuous cycle. And that virtuous cycle being displayed in this manner. So investment, which itself would require savings, and I'll come to that in just in a minute. Some of the proposals in the budget are actually related to, are related to basically trying to trigger this virtuous cycle. So investment and saving, which lead to increases in productivity, and thereby lead to exports and jobs, and that's where the complementarities come in very crucially, and thereby demand, which anticipating demand, people sort of firms invest. And I think this is something that all of us here certainly know in parts, and many of you in that system as a whole. But that's where we think we've sort of tried to provide a different take on the way to pursue the economic development in India. So this is sort of, and there are a bunch of charts in the first chapter. What I'm going to do is, so we focus primarily on China and East Asia, but in the interest of time, just going to show you some charts from using China. What we've seen for China, I think, applies equally well for other countries as well. This to me was actually, I think many of you have seen this before, but when I set out to actually think about how to sort of integrate the ideas together, to me this was quite informative. The red line here actually is consumption, and the green and the blue lines are basically investment and savings respectively. The fact that consumption decreased significantly for China starting from 1980s, and investment and savings increased actually was something that was quite informative. What we then did is, this is sort of what I showed you earlier was calendar time, but if we look at here on development time, which is on the x-axis is log GDP per capita. These are all logs to the base 10, just to sort of enhance readability there. What we find here is, and on the y-axis, instead of plotting the log of each of these variables, we've actually plotted the log of, not the log, actually the share as a percentage of GDP. So exports, savings, and investment. And to me, at least, this was quite informative. Of course, you will notice that the latter half on the exports, I think we're sort of doing a linear fit when it really doesn't look like a linear fit. But didn't want to get into too complicated stuff for the survey. So what I take away from this particular chart is that as GDP per capita kept increasing, the shares of exports, shares of investments, and shares of savings in China kept increasing further, and that is when one contrasts that with what we found during the financial crisis and the euro crisis as well. So one got to see both sides actually, in some ways, the virtuous cycle and the vicious cycles when times are bad. This is when times are good. So this is sort of and there are sort of deeper dives that are there in the chapter. But in the interest of time, sort of just want to just sort of focus on this particular chart primarily. Also, if the complementarities that I spoke about here on the left side, what you see is how investment correlates with multi-factor productivity, and multi-factor productivity in turn with growth in exports. Now, remember, actually, one could dig further into sort of the causality, but the way if you're thinking about this as a virtuous cycle, every variable is effectively endogenous, and it's sort of, we're thinking about a vector system there. So this is sort of showing that investment leads to productivity, which is all, I think we know that very well in this audience certainly, and that affects exports. To us, I think this part was quite crucial on the export side, because people have talked about and when I've been part of some of the discussions, let's talk give some tax breaks, etc. But exports really are about the competitiveness, and that's what seems to come about when we look at this particular set of charts. And this is sort of showing the negative correlation between unemployment and investment, sort of showing that there are indeed complementarities across these variables. So the key question, of course, was what is that key driver? And I think, again, for people who are trained in the way we are, I think investment, seems quite obvious to basically think about that. So this is showing how demographics, feeds that virtuous cycle. Both, left side charts are for China, the right side charts are for East Asia. In the top panels, you look at how demographic change happened, starting from the 1980s up till 2010. So the share of working population increased significantly, in China and the 4 East Asian economies that are being shown on the right, and that in turn also, sort of manifested in savings. And this, basically work by Nick Bloom and others, showing how demographics was significantly responsible for the for the savings pattern in East Asia and the growth itself. So this is that's the way we viewed it, sort of this virtuous cycle with which gets fed by the favorable demographics. Of course, there are that's where the virtuous cycle, the element of jobs comes in critically, because unless you have good wages, you can't save either. So that's sort of the important part to remember. Now, one I think which I was quite excited about, writing a chapter which, especially in the Indian context, is behavioral economics. I was lucky enough to be able to learn this from Richard Thaler when I was doing my PhD. And so when I set about thinking about the survey, to me this seemed like an obvious one to sort of write about, especially because in our country the effect of norms, whether it's actually social or cultural norms, seem to play so much of a role in affecting behavior. And behavioral economics therefore sort of provides some of the tools not only to understand how this behavior gets shaped by norms, but also in a sort of a paternalistic nudge manner, without really changing any of the preferences of the individuals, to really sort of bring about some change. And we used 2 of the campaigns that I think have sort of become signature campaigns of the last 5 years. One is the Swachh Bharat mission, and the other is the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. Less successful compared to the Swachh Bharat mission, but we looked at both of those to sort of glean some learnings and thereby lay out an agenda for behavioral change. So this is the micro aspect of the survey. So what we saw is that, so this is basically, I think these charts really illustrate what, of course you can get into sort of more of the rigorous analysis, but this is sort of if you will, a univariate. So 2015-16 versus 2018-19, the coverage of individual household latrines, and on the right, that's on the left, on the right actually the open defecation free villages. And I think the green versus the red is actually is enough. I don't think I need to say anything more. This is sort of trying to look at it in a little bit more of careful manner, difference in difference, trying to use the coverage of the individual household latrine as of March 2015. Of course, as you saw here, that in those villages or districts where the IHHL coverage was low, that's where the increase was significant, and therefore one would expect the treatment effect to be higher there. And that's why what we've done here is looking at health outcomes, because if it is indeed that there has been an effect on sanitation, one should go and observe that in health outcomes. And this is the cases of children up below 5 years being affected by diarrhea. And what you notice on the left side, the red ones are for districts where the coverage was low as of March 2015, and the right are for those where actually the coverage was high. So clearly we would expect the treatment effect to be greater on the left. And what we see here is basically also seen with other variables, which is the malaria cases for children under 5 years, number of stillbirths, and underweight newborns, and this is sort of some new evidence that we brought as part of this chapter. Then this is the other campaign that I spoke about, the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, which is showing the impact on sex ratio at birth. Here clearly the difference is not as stark as we saw with the SBM, but still there is improvement. In fact, the chapter also has a chart showing the change. This is basically the two levels, but showing the change across the geographies. So then we went about sort of putting out some key principles for behavioral change, having looked at the literature, and these are the 7 key principles, and there are, we've taken up various different, agenda, whether it's gender equality, whether it's tax evasion, trying to apply these principles and providing specific suggestions for how these principles can be activated for bringing behavioral change, which is, I think this is, people here definitely would know about, leveraging default rules, making it easy to choose, leveraging default rules without changing the choice architecture, making it easy to choose, emphasizing social norms, which I think in the Indian context is quite important, disclosing outcomes, reinforcing repeatedly, leveraging loss aversion, and making the messages mimic the mental models. And for instance, the fact that the Swachh Bharat mission was launched on the 2nd of October, and the concept of Swachhagrahis to actually to mimic that mental model of Satyagrahas or Satyagrahis, I think was an example of using behavioral economics to try and bring about behavioral change. And then, so 4 different, using these learnings, we laid out what can be done going forward in terms of behavioral change, from Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao to what we coined it as Badlav, which is Beti Aapki, Dhan Lakshmi or Vijay Lakshmi, and this is sort of relying on the concept, the way we most of us Indians think about, in sort of our cultural moods, if you will. From the Swachh Bharat mission to the Swasth and the Sundar Bharat mission, those of you who would have heard the PM's Varanasi speech on Saturday, he referred to this as well in the, as part of his $5 trillion economy as well. From Give It Up's LPG subsidy to thinking about the subsidy, this was, first instance of sort of trying to nudge people to, to sort of give up their subsidy voluntarily. But that can be, I think there is, by learning from there are possibilities of taking this further, and tax evasion to tax compliance, and given the tax to GDP ratio being so low, which is something that we could work on. So then I think this is another, and again, there's been a lot of work in this area, so what we've really tried to do is to put together this work, trying to ask the question, if we basically, job creation and exports, why is it that those are not doing very well? And actually, we basically felt that it's primarily because of the lack of economies of scale, given that we basically have sort of too many dwarfs in the economy. And this is sort of just a statistic to take away. A number of firms, this is from ASI data, so this is basically organized manufacturing. If you look at the number of firms, they, by number they occupy almost 85%, but their contribution to employment and to value added is very, very low. In contrast, the large firms, on the other hand, actually have about 16%, and their contribution to employment and value added is quite high. Now, large, remember, actually is large only in the Indian context. The cut we've made is 99 employees, which really is actually very small even by global standards. But if you were to sort of cut it maybe at 500 or 1,000, then actually this percentage will be really, really very small. So the way we, in order to try and explain this, to a larger audience, the metaphor that I used is one of a dwarf tree versus a large tree. A large tree gives us shade, gives us fruits as well, and once it was nurtured, when that tree was a sapling, it basically takes care of itself. On the other hand, the dwarf tree gives us neither fruits nor shade and has to be continuously nurtured. The other idea, and then the question we ask is, why is it that we have so many dwarfs in the economy? And the key takeaway for us, and urge you to read this chapter, is especially so many size-based incentives. So it just seems so natural when I sit across these saying, oh, let's do this for whatever rule if you have for companies over X, in terms of turnover, or Y in terms of profits. So in some way, we basically create this perverse incentive for firms to remain small. And the way the metaphor that I think about is that, all of us, when we had our kids, kids learning to cycle, we gave them those support wheels. But if we had told those, our kids that, you can have these support wheels for life, I wonder whether they would have become independent bikers. And that's sort of the idea here, that in some sense we need to, make these firms stand up on their own better by removing all these shackles and that create perverse incentives. And this is from from the QJE paper by Klinau. Yeah, so I think clearly illustrates how, as firms age, as a comparison in the United States, for instance, compared to the size or number of employees they have when the firm is young, less than 5 years, it's creating almost 7 times as much employment, a 40-year-old firm, provided it survives till then. That's the average. In contrast, India is only 40%. I think that's just sort of so stark that 7 times and 40% growth, and even Mexico actually is double. So same thing what we see with employment also transpires with productivity as well, which has important implications for exports. So it's the fact that we basically don't have, or we don't have is endogenous, because the kind of incentives we provide them, and this has been going on for the last 7 decades, of just trying to foster these dwarfs. This, what I think about in my mind as this fascination with dwarfs, and the way policies basically perpetuate that. So the key, just in the interest of time, let me actually quickly just mention, this is using the labor reform in Rajasthan versus the other states. And what we find is these are CAGR, cumulative annual growth rates, before, after reform for Rajasthan versus rest of India. And what we find is number of firms with greater than 100 employees went up. The output also output per factory, and number of workers per factory also went up as a result of this labor reform in 2014. So what are the ways in which we can sort of get over this fascination with dwarfs, and thereby increase productivity, increase job creation as well in the economy? I think it's obvious, given what I've talked about, which is that incentivize infant firms. Actually, it's that metaphor of trying to protect the kid when the kid is learning to bicycle, but making it very clear that after a few days, or maybe a week, couple of weeks, those support wheels are going to be taken away. And so that's the way to possibly do that. And this is something which I believe that one way of doing it, which is a sunset clause for incentives, which is move away from these incentives which are based on size, instead make those incentives based on age. There is a chart in the chapter which shows how this skewed distribution that you see for size does not manifest with age, though. Age actually, distribution seems to be much more, if you look at it in terms of number versus versus productivity or employment, that skewed distribution does not transpire with age. So provide incentives based on age, and now with sort of Aadhaar and other technologies, it is easy to also sort of plug some loopholes, where promoters create a firm, once it's, let's say, a certain age, then they close it and start another. I think that can be tracked as well. With those, we can provide incentives based on age with necessary grandfathering. This is sort of course, the political economy of a change like this, and trying to sort of navigate that political economy reasonably well. Because the fear was that if one said this without actually grandfathering, the idea may be stillborn. To sort of guard against that, focus on infant firms, especially in some of those sectors where the employment elasticity is high, and service sectors with high spillovers. So. Another chapter which I actually was personally excited about is this, thinking about data as a public good. What we've called it as data by the people, of the people, for the people. So, in the interest of time, I'll just sort of lay out a couple of wishful thinking scenarios, and how data can thereby sort of enable those scenarios possibly. So on the left side, think about someone who's actually, a lady in a remote village who, somebody in a family or maybe in a village becomes sick, but the lady can, on her smartphone, find out hospitals that are close by. Not only that, she can basically go and click on a particular hospital and find out the quality of those, of the services that are provided, emergency care versus maybe, let's say, versus geriatric care, etc. and thereby then, decide where to go. And this could possibly be, in many cases, may result in saving lives. And that that's a data sort of enhances ease of living for sure, but makes a particular difference in. And when you combine that with, let's say that we have we've also talked about a public health registry with all the necessary, checks and balances for ensuring privacy of data and ownership of the data by the agent. But that's something that is possible. I think with India Stack and before that with Aadhaar, it's been demonstrated that this can be done and there is a privacy law that is actually in Parliament now to enable that within that framework. On the right, think about someone, think about a farmer who wants to apply for a loan, and this is basically, it's an app. The farmer goes and requests the amount of the loan, the tenor of the loan, and also then gives his permission to say that, I allow the bank to go and access my data to decide whether I should be given the loan or not, to screen. And with that permission, then the bank goes and uses fintech to try and decide, whether the borrower should get the loan or not. And in the end, without the farmer having to go, run from pillar to post, if the loan is granted, it's just credited directly to the account of the farmer, and he just gets an SMS saying, okay, your loan has been granted. So imagine actually he will not have to lose many days of wages in running from to the banks. And this is something that by viewing data as a public good, that's something that can. A last one that I wanted to actually talk about, I think this is something, especially in the World Bank rankings on ease of contractual enforcement, we are at the bottom 15%, 163rd out of 190 odd countries, which I think is clearly, it's related to the backlog of cases that we have. So 3.5 crore cases, that's for the foreigners in the audience, that's 35 million cases that's a backlog of. What we find is, using the data that new data that we've put together, almost 90% of these cases are in the lower courts, in the subordinate and the district courts. What we then did is basically saying, is there a way of trying to do two things? If this backlog has to be cleared, two things have to happen. First thing is, so think about it in terms of the stock versus the flow. First, with the flow of cases, we have to ensure that there is 100% clearance. So there is no accumulation of the flow into the stock. And at the same time, the other is that then we have to think about a way of clearing that stock as well, the backlog of cases. So we did some estimations, just to highlight that this problem, unlike maybe some others who think is insurmountable, this problem is not insurmountable. It can be done in the next 5 years. And I think the main message was this, to say this can be done, rather than trying to actually just sort of, wring off hands and say, oh, this is something that we cannot do anything about. So with high courts, actually, 100% clearance can be achieved with 93 additional judges, which is within sanctioned capacity, and that is an important point to note. With the district and subordinate courts, which is what I spoke about as 90% of cases there are, about 2,300 judges, which is also within sanctioned capacity, that you can achieve 100% clearance rate using that. That then leaves the backlog, and here we focused on productivity improvements that can be achieved by a combination of three things. One, of course, technology, and there are countries like Singapore and others who are actually using technology. Second, providing the backbone, administrative backbone for the judiciary to ensure that processes are actually a lot more streamlined. And third, especially in the context of the Supreme Court and the High Court, the vacation times. So what we find in the data is that the number of days that the district and subordinate courts work is very, very similar to any other civil servant, but the same is actually not true for High Court and Supreme Court. Now, sometimes actually there might be a contention that, oh, judges need that time to think about the case. I would sort of reckon that policymakers across different areas need time as well, and when policymakers can actually clock the number of days that that any other civil servant works, I don't see that argument holding that much water with basically High Court and Supreme Courts. So vacation times can be reduced. Together, all those can actually they can bring about a 25% increase in productivity for the district and subordinate courts, 18% for the Supreme Court, and a mere 4% for high courts. Then this backlog can be cleared in the next 5 years. Now, I must concede that the calculations that we've done here these are not very sophisticated, and that is how it was intended, to show that even very simple calculations illustrate this point. This is something that is insurmountable. So what we are claiming as 5 years could possibly be maybe 6 years, or 7 years, but that is not the point. The point being that this is something that is possible to do, and that's the message that we've tried to convey using this particular chapter. So in sum, what we tried to do, and this was the hashtag that was trending on the day of the economic survey, which is hashtag EcoSurvey 2019 and hashtag Economy 5 trillion. Provide a strategic blueprint for the economy to become a $5 trillion economy by basically shifting gears through a virtuous cycle with investment as the key driver. And that was the macro view that we took. But this can't happen without micro level change, and that's where behavioral economics we felt was an important tool, especially in the Indian context, with the influence that norms, both social and cultural, have on our behavior. That can't happen without actually exports and jobs, and that's where the unshackling MSMEs with all the sort of this fascination with dwarfs that we have, removing that, letting MSMEs grow, because when MSMEs grow, the biggest beneficiaries are the promoters themselves, because they actually get huge profits. So that's the other part of this this jigsaw puzzle, if you will. Data as a public good, which can not only enable the ease of living, but also contribute to better policy making. And clearing the logjam. In fact, this may be the last, but certainly not the least, because what we say in the chapter is this may possibly be the best investment that we can make in trying to enforce contracts, enhance contractual enforcement, and which can have several spillover benefits on the economy. Thank you very much for your patience. Happy to take some questions.
So if there are any questions, please raise your placard up. Anybody? We have at least one previous chief economic advisor in the room. I'm looking at Kaushik, who is about to raise his placard, which he has. Yes, Kaushik.
Shekhar is already implementing the nudge.
Can you use your microphone, please?
Very nice to meet you for the first time. It's an unusual way to meet, but you get
Dr. Basi, you would remember we've met actually on television when you were in the CEA role and I was actually in the media.
Well, Madam, with the Ministry of Finance as well. I actually want to, I've never noticed that. People don't notice that they haven't done well. We need to get this up. So I would like a little bit of thought and analysis from you of the kinds of things that can be done to get the saving. We don't want to go to levels that China went, which is excessive, but there is room to go up.
Absolutely.
And as you rightly stress, and I think that stress was very important, that's a major trigger of long-run growth. We've seen it in East Asia. So some concrete plans to get investment and savings up.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion. We have tried to, a table, if you get a chance to take a look at in the behavioral economics chapter, is on, some of these nudges that can be done on the savings side. I think and I did not have time to talk about it, in some of the media interviews I articulated that given current level of savings, which is not very high at this point, to trigger this virtuous cycle, we may need to sort of tap into the foreign savings, which are actually at this point in time quite flush with it. And that's why if you the budget had proposals for both on FDI and FPI. There's also this, the budget talked about trying to, raise money in the sovereign, and there's been, of course, debate about this. It's, I think, unquestionably there is some risk, but the view that I have is that as long as that risk gets managed very well, it's something that can really benefit. We can tap, because in some sense the kind of liquidity conditions that are there in the interest rate environment, which is so benign and expected to be benign in the, it's an opportunity to utilize. A related benefit which I actually was thinking is that, having sort of seen some of the meetings with these credit rating agencies, somehow I have felt that our sort of interaction with them is, as a studious kid that many of us would have been, going to the teacher saying, "Ma'am, I've been such a good student, can you actually give me a few more marks?" Which has been sort of the approach that we've followed. Instead, why not say, okay, here's the, the State Bank of India's CDS spread is this much. The sovereign should list basically at much less than that, and then that back calculate what will be the rating based on that, and say, go take a look. The market is basically telling us, giving us a spread that is actually much better than what you're giving us. It's just another way of, and there are, of course, I think, other aspects that need to be considered. But these are two ways possibly to try and trigger this cycle. But more thoughts actually, I think would be more welcome.
Can I put in one more comment, Shekhar? This is just something very positive. The fact that you mentioned values and tax compliance. Too little emphasis is given because in economics we don't create space for values.
Yes.
But when I joined the World Bank, the first report was actually on behavioral and development.
Yes.
And there was a lot of emphasis, so I'm very glad that you're push hard on that. I can tell you that these things get swept under the carpet at some point, I know from experience, so push hard.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Any other questions? Yes, please, Devesh. Turn on your mic, please.
Could you give us your views on India's trade policies? There's a sense that we've been increasing our tariffs. We are going back to our old protectionist ways. If you look around the world, do you think we should join RCEP? We are seen as the only country that is trying to hold out and blocking those trade agreements. We are likely to be isolated and not be part of any large global trading system. So we'd like to hear your views on where you think India should go on trade policy.
So is this on? Yeah. So I can share that I think this is something that's being talked about carefully, in the government. But as we talk, we still are sort of, balancing the various trade-offs. So I will not be able to give you a particular view in this. But I did allude to, in my presentation, one aspect that I think is really critical in this context is the productivity. And if we look at, when our FTAs across, many of those FTAs after signing, we've sort of, we've not benefited as much as we can. And my one view, of course, there could be other views, is that we basically are not able to compete as well because we're not productive enough, and that's something that we need to emphasize. And this is my personal view, is that, and I think many of us here would sort of have the same view, is palliatives are not going to work in this area.
Yeah, so just a few quick comments, all related to things you said. I think the first on savings and investment, a very simple suggestion is, I know we obsess a lot about ease of doing business, but in the end, that's two cities and highly non-representative data.
Yes.
So, I think, rankings are good, and it's a good way of focusing attention on something that matters. But see, for something like social sector where you need measurement, that's fine. But for investment, there is a market test. So, so the simple suggestion is, instead of obsessing on the rankings, is to just actually look at the numbers of investment at the state level and use that and make that the focal point, so that it's the reveal preference outcome that we focus on. So that's an easy one.
Let me respond to that actually. So there is a chapter that we've written on economic policy uncertainty and how that, so this is the Bloom et al. An index, using that and showing how that correlates with investment, which is sort of to the point that you were talking about. Rather than just looking at sort of a ranking which captures, does not capture fully. Instead, if you look at the sort of the reveal preference, I think, let's acknowledge that there would be some limitations with any index when you're trying to, but it still captures reveal preference in a better manner than let's say your the World Bank rankings. And what is interesting is that it shows a correlation with investment. And so some of the policy suggestions we've made is sort of being more consistent with and with the vision and the blueprint, because remember that in an uncertain world, you can't say that we'll basically be totally predictable. You will need, and that's why the way we've laid it out is actually the vision, which is provided by the Prime Minister, of a $5 trillion economy. The survey basically lays out the blueprint, the strategic blueprint, and some of the tactical tools to employ. But as long as policy, policy changes are consistent with that vision and the blueprint, investors will try and understand that, okay, this is basically just trying to sort of calibrate into that strategic blueprint. But what is crucial is, another suggestion was made, again, this basically comes from some of my experience in working in the private sector. For instance, a lot of companies use these, quality assurance, which is, document what you do and do what you document. So we've made this suggestion that maybe government departments can think about basically trying an external evaluation of how they, how their processes are working. Are they really consistent, or are you being sort of, not very consistent? So these are some suggestions that we've made, I think, in taking forward, I think a very, very valuable comment of yours.
Yeah, no, I think, and the point is, which is why I think the first couple of years, the focus and ease of doing, I think everybody welcomed it because it shows this strategic
Correct.
shift.
Yes.
The concern, of course, is bureaucracies respond to what's being measured, and if you measure that, then you'll
Yes.
do exactly that,
Absolutely.
as opposed to the find
Correct.
out. And then let me just make one more point on what you said on both exports as well as productivity. So I think the kind of analysis that would be incredibly useful is Amartya Lahiri and I were talking, for example, about just comparing the cost bar of textile firms in Bangladesh and India.
Yeah.
And if you just look at the timed cost or total cost of producing the identical shirt across these places and break it down into segments, that sort of exercise I think would be incredibly valuable, saying which part of that, right, like is fundamentals versus other things. And I think what really worries me about the creeping increase of tariffs, it's not just, the Habaga triangles are small tariffs. It's kind of what it means for integration in global production chains and kind of the dampening effect it puts on anybody wanting to make those investments. I think, to the extent that I understand there are political economy considerations, these are things that may hopefully help strengthen your case on these things.
So my I think that's an excellent suggestion. As you see, I've already put it down on my phone. And we will definitely try and examine that. I'll sort of share the way I approach political economy, in the internal discussions. Is duty of someone like anyone like us is to try and for instance, actually, just to give an example, I tweeted yesterday on the Air India thing, and the tweet I made was that. So I've traveled, early on when I was working, I've traveled in the Mumbai locals. And one thing that you notice in the Mumbai locals is if you get into the, in the Churchgate station, then people after Churchgate basically don't get a chance to get in at all. People who get in, and it happens actually, and I've had, let's say now I would say the privilege of traveling in a third-class compartment in the railway, train as well. There too, whoever gets in the first station ensures his or her very best to not let anybody else in. And that's sort of and what we have to highlight is that, and the tweet I made is that the 100 at Churchgate versus the millions who want to get to their destination. Whether we think about it in terms of labor reforms or whether we think about it in terms of, those who are basically unionized versus unemployed or taxpayer, it's the silent majority versus the vocal minority, and it's our duty to basically point out that it's politically well aligned to think about the silent majority, and that's what people like us have to basically point out to those who are listening. Yeah.
Subbu, last question, and this goes to something that many people missed in the budget speech in particular. And that's the focus on foundational learning and on schooling.
Yeah.
We are at a learning crisis that I think far exceeds any other crisis that we think about, with huge long-term consequences. Any thoughts on that?
I think, excellent point. So I will concede that there are a couple of, important areas that we did not talk about in the survey. And that was a choice that we made. For instance, agriculture is something that we've not talked about. Education and skilling that you've talked, certainly. But as I mentioned, in my preamble to the remarks, when we started thinking about the survey, what we felt is a choice to make. Rather, should we basically lay out a blueprint, given that this is the first survey for the new government, versus focusing on? And what we also realized that we have to write another survey in 6 months. And so, and many of the ideas that you're actually talking about, hopefully we'll be able to do justice to some of those in the next one.
Okay. With that, let's give Subbu a big hand for coming, sparing the time, and we'll move on to our next session. You're most welcome to stay on, please, if you can.
Travel, actually,
yeah.
so.
Okay.